Hey everybody, Jennifer Schaus here. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C., and thanks for joining us in our 2024 webinar series. As you know, we're covering the FAR, or the Federal Acquisition Regulations. There are 52 total parts with a couple reserved sections, and we're going to cover those every Wednesday and Friday, except for this week, we're skipping Friday due to the Easter holiday. All of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. If you want to get a jump start on any of the recordings, hop over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. It doesn't cost you anything except 10 seconds of your time. If you're looking for the PowerPoints, those are over on slideshare.net, also complimentary. You can log in there with your LinkedIn credentials. Okay, our series, it can be found on our website under the section called the FAR. They are all listed there in the order that we're covering them, which is we're going sequentially through each part of the FAR. The recordings are also posted on this page, so at least by close of business today, we should have the recording listed on our website, or again, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and get it a little bit quicker. For anyone that's looking for any of the parts that we have yet to cover, so FAR Part 19 and beyond, we did actually cover the FAR in 2020. So you can navigate to our website, go to the section called webinars, scroll down to the FAR 2020. Keep in mind that these are going to be 4 years old, so a little bit dated. Some of the regulations have in fact changed. So if you are listening to something from 4 years ago, just be cognizant of the fact that it is in fact 4 years old. A little bit about us. We do provide consulting services for government contractors, primarily focused on helping companies get onto the GSA schedule, and then some of the post-award services, anything related to modifications, audits, renewals, mass mods, all of that. So if you have questions or want more information about our services, either go to our website, go to About Us, or you can send us an email to the hello@jenniferschaus.com. In the event that your company is selling to federal contractors, we do offer advertising opportunities here in our webinar series, as well as in our Monday newsletter, which now reaches 29,300 plus subscribers, most of which are government contractors. We also have events throughout the year, typically over at the Kennedy Center here in Washington, D.C., with anywhere from 300 to 400 attendees. You can contact us for more information and send us an email asking for the media kit. Okay, some things that are coming up. Tomorrow, actually, we've got a live webinar with our friends over at the Western Michigan Apex Accelerator, formerly the PTAC. This is 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's complimentary. If you're looking for the registration link, it's on our website under the section called Events. Even though this is not an event, it is a webinar. If you need help with THS PACS or NASA Soup, also shoot us an email to the hello@jenniferschaus.com. Some of our sponsored content webinars that are coming up in June. It's a two-part series on SBIRs and STTRs with Carrie Palmatier from Palmatier Law. These are also found, the registration links are also found on our website under the event section, even though these are remotely conducted webinars. And now we want to thank our webinar sponsors. These are the organizations that allow us to make the webinar series complimentary for you. So first, we want to thank our friends over at GovEvents. They're the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600 plus webinars. We want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert. That's the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, HUB-zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. Also, the Virginia Apex Accelerator, formerly the PTAC, at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received, and they're based on counselor availability. due to very high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on your business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce monthly Government Contracting Council meeting to network with contracting peers, learn about upcoming events, opportunities, and contribute to future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month. They just had one yesterday, so next month will be April 23rd. If you've got questions, you can contact Alicia Field. Her email is there at the bottom of your screen. They also have, the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce also has their annual B2G matchmaking conference. This is going to be on May 2nd. We hope to see you there. It's over at the Sheraton Hotel in Reston, Virginia. Registration link is there at the bottom of your screen. It's pretty easy to navigate to that. BidSpeed. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find bidding opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and other proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. SBA 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program. The FBC, Federal Business Council. Excuse me, events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. FBC has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity and symposiums, tech expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at fbcinc.com. GovBrew. Please check out our friends over at GovBrew. They are the most read government contracting newsletter, keeping thousands of government contracting professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, now the reason that we're here today is to cover the FAR Part 18. We're joined by Lucas Hanback. He's put together some great slides for you all, and we're thankful to have him here with us today, sharing his time and expertise on FAR Part 18, emergency acquisitions. Lucas, I'm going to put myself on mute, and I'll turn the floor over to you. Just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jennifer. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Next slide, please. So as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Lucas Hanback. I'm a shareholder with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell. I work out of their DC office. Today, we're going to cover FAR Part 18. This is an agenda that shows what we'll cover today. I'll give an overview of Part 18 and talk about the different purposes of the two subparts that you find in Part 18. I'll give you some details on the use of each subpart, and then I'll close up with some recommendations about how to use this. Next slide, please. So as an overview, FAR Part 18 is an interesting part of the FAR if you've ever looked at it. It has no associated contract provisions or clauses in FAR Part 52. And the reason for that, as you'll see when we start to go through it, is that it internally references other provisions of the FAR in various parts. And those parts already have provisions that would apply if you're using FAR Part 18. So generally, FAR Part 18 is not really a standalone authority that gives any kind of procurement authority. What it does do is it supplements the existing authority, and it provides revisions to certain thresholds and rules that apply for competition when certain conditions are met. So what you'll see as we go through this is that some of what you see in FAR Part 18 is always available under certain circumstances, and then others require specific declarations for example, a national emergency. And so what you'll see in here is that there are various things throughout all the rest of the parts of the FAR that can always be relied on And then those ones that apply only where there are declarations of national emergency typically adjust thresholds that you have to use in order to use certain simplified procedures. A couple of things to note before we get into this that are not in the slides, but the acquisition flexibilities that are available here are not exempt from some of the requirements and limitations that you find in FAR Part 3, which governs improper business practices and personal conflicts of interest. So you need to be mindful that just because some of these flexibilities exist, it doesn't, permit anything that's illegal or otherwise improper. Next slide. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, FAR Part 18 has two subparts. Subpart 18.1 covers acquisition flexibilities that are always available, and these are found in other parts of the FAR whenever you meet the conditions that would trigger their use. Now, there are lots of these. I think right now there are 25 of them, and we'll look at each of them and talk very briefly about what they are and what they do. FAR Part 18.1 really serves as a reference sheet that can help you quickly find flexibilities that you may need if you're, an agency procurement official and you need to figure out a fast way to cut a contract, or if you're a customer and your agency is asking you for something and wants to know how you can get it done quickly. You should take a look at FAR Part 18.1 and see what's in there and see if any of it already applies to the situation that you're in, because it may give you a streamlined way to proceed and get the goods or services that are needed. Part 18.2 is a little bit different. There it has flexibilities that exist only when certain circumstances come into play. Those are a contingency operation when we are in defense or recovery from cyber, nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological attack, when the president makes a national emergency declaration, or when there's a humanitarian or peacekeeping operation. Those four things require a specific invocation of authority and a declaration that the conditions are met. And whenever those circumstances exist, what these provisions do is they increase the thresholds at which you can use certain streamlined acquisition procedures. And so we'll take a look at those as we get to this, but just for example, the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition thresholds typically be increased when you are operating under one of these, though not always to the same extent and in the same way. So we'll look at that as we go through. Next slide, please. So we'll start with subpart 18.1. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is really a cheat sheet with cross references to other FAR provisions that are always available for use if you meet the conditions necessary to invoke them. These flexibilities do not require an emergency declaration or any kind of a designation. And there are 25 different flexibilities that are listed. And when you look at this part of the FAR, you will see that what they have done is they have helpfully cross-referenced the citation elsewhere in the FAR where the flexibility can be found so that you can see where it is and go there and look at what it does and how you can use it. Next slide, please. So there's not much to FAR Part 18.1. When you go in there and look at it, what you will see is it jumps right in and just starts listing the general flexibilities that are always available. And we'll go down and discuss a few of these and talk about what they are and what they do. So the first one that you will see is 18.102. Now, as a quick note before we jump in there, 18.101 is just a general provision that reinforces the point I made on the last slide that these flexibilities are always available and don't require an emergency declaration. The actual flexibilities themselves start with 18.102. 18.102 is a provision that reminds you helpfully that you're not required to be registered in SAM as a contractor at the time of submissions of offers or quotations for contracts that are awarded due to unusual and compelling urgency, or contracts that are awarded by a contracting officer who's deployed in the course of military operations or located outside the United States and its outlying areas for work that would be performed in support of diplomatic or developmental operations or in an area that's been designated by the Department of State as a danger pay post. The SAM registration is also not required in the conduct of emergency operations. So SAM registration, it's not super complicated, but it can be a thing that occasionally contractors will get hung up on. I was helping a contractor recently who was having an issue because the address that they entered into SAM as their current address was not reflected on the organization paperwork that they had filed with the state. So it took them a little bit of time to iron that out. This flexibility in certain circumstances would allow you to smooth that over and get around it because SAM registration would not be required. 18.103 is a reminder that you don't have to synopsize proposed contract actions in certain circumstances, specifically where there's an unusual and compelling urgency, and the government would be seriously injured if the agency complied with the notice time periods that are normally required under FAR Part 5. If you can meet the requirements under FAR 5.202A2, then you are not required to synopsize your contract actions. And so a thing that you might see already here is these are things that cut time off of the acquisition process. So the idea here is they allow you to skip certain steps or shorten certain periods. And what this list is doing is it collects a bunch of these things that can help streamline the process so that you can determine, how quickly and by what means you can acquire goods or services that you need. 18.104 is unusual and compelling urgency. So this is a reminder that agencies can always limit the number of sources, and full and open competition is not required for contract actions that involve urgent requirements. Now you do have to meet the requirements that are there in FAR 6.302-2, and so this isn't just a blanket get out of jail free card here. You have to have under 6.302-2, you have to have an unusual and compelling urgency that precludes the use of full and open competition. And the government has to determine that a delay in the award of the contract would result in serious injury, financial or other, to the government. But if the government can meet those requirements, it can use unusual and compelling urgency as a means by which to limit the number of sources that it solicits. FAR 18.105 is a reminder that you can use federal supply schedules, blanket purchase agreements, or IDIQ contracts in order to streamline the procurement. Just as a general background reminder, all of these types of vehicles are pre-established and already have agreed upon terms and conditions. The negotiation over price has typically already taken place to some extent at least, and because there is a baseline vehicle that is already in place, placing an order against one of these things is another way to streamline the procurement to meet your needs. And one other thing to remember is that in certain circumstances, agencies can piggyback off of an established schedule or IDIQ contract with another agency, provided that they follow the legal requirements to do that. So, this is a reminder in FAR Part 18 that this kind of flexibility is there, and it can offer advanced planning, pre-negotiated terms, and special terms and conditions that would permit you to rapidly respond to needs. Next slide, please. FAR 18.106 talks about acquisitions from the federal prison industries. So this is a reminder. So federal prison industries portion of the FAR in FAR 8.6 requires that certain purchases be made from FPI most of the time, but it is not mandatory and there's not a waiver required if there's a public exigency that requires immediate delivery or performance. So one of the other themes that you should be starting to see as we're going through these is that where you have unusual and compelling urgency, and that there's an emergency need that you need to address, there are throughout the FAR in various places provisions that allow you to sidestep normal requirements for competition or required sources, so long as you can show that there is an unusual and compelling urgency. Similarly, FAR 18.107 operates the same way for Ability 1 purchases. Normally, where you would be required to purchase from Ability 1, you do not have to do that if there are emergency needs, and the reference for that is if you can meet the requirements under FAR 8.712B. FAR 18.108 speaks to qualification requirements, and I didn't include this one on the slide, but there is a FAR 18.108, and what it says is agencies can determine not to enforce qualification requirements that might normally apply when an emergency exists. The citation for that is FAR 9.206-1 is where the authority is otherwise in the FAR, but qualification requirements would normally preclude people from competing for certain contracts. But where there's an emergency, you can waive the qualification requirements and procure from whomever can meet the need. FAR 18.109 is a reminder that the DPAS system, the Defense Priorities and Allocation System, will allow you to use rated orders to obtain preferential treatment of the orders. So this one is more useful perhaps for agency contracting personnel. If you can justify the use of a DPAS rated order, that would allow you to place the order with a contractor and require them to give preferential treatment so that that order gets bumped to the front of the line of whatever they're working on and gets delivered first. Now, you have to follow the rules that govern the DPAS system, and there's cross-reference to this in the FAR is subpart 11.6. But provided that you properly invoke the authority and issue a properly rated order, then you would follow the rules under the DPAS system, and if it's a proper DPAS order, it would allow you to obtain the goods faster than you otherwise would be able to. FAR 18.110 or 110 reminds you that you can solicit from a single source if you are soliciting for goods or services below the simplified acquisition threshold. The citation for that is FAR 13.106-1B. That one's pretty straightforward. Do remember, though, that the simplified acquisition threshold, if you go and look at the definition of it in FAR 2.101, is different depending on whether certain conditions are met. Generally, it's 250,000, but there are certain times when it can be more, depending on what is going on and what type of procurement you're conducting. Next slide, please. FAR 18.111 allows oral requests for proposals under certain conditions. And if you go to the FAR 15.203F that's cited, what you'll find is that you can do this when you're processing a written solicitation, and it would delay the acquisition of supplies or services if you had to do that in a way that would be detrimental to the government. And the other condition is that a notice is not required under FAR 5.202. So in other words, these would be things that are perishable. They might be supporting contingency operations or other emergency situations. When those conditions are met, you can use oral RFPs rather than having to develop a formal written RFP, which takes a significant amount of time and effort in order to do it. 18.112 governs letter contracts. And letter contracts can be used when performance has to begin immediately under FAR 16.603. If you go there, you see that the conditions to use these are that the government's interests must demand that the contractor be given a binding commitment so that work can start immediately. And negotiating a definitive contract is not possible in sufficient time to meet the requirement. So the idea here is that you would use a letter contract to get work starting quickly. You would ultimately come back and negotiate a definitive contract, but having a letter contract in place would allow performance to start immediately while the definitive contract is being negotiated. FAR 18.113 is a reminder about interagency acquisitions. I touched on this a couple of slides ago when I talked about the use of FSS, BPAs, or IDIQs. But it's a reminder that interagency acquisitions are authorized under certain conditions that are described in subpart 17.5. Essentially, what agencies have to do is comply with the Economy Act, and in a very general sense, what that requires is that agencies follow the procurement rules for both of the agencies. So remember that the way that the FAR is structured, each agency there's the basic FAR, and then each agency has a supplement. For example, the Department of Defense has the DFAR. And when interagency procurements are used, agencies just have to make sure under the Economy Act that they're following the rules that apply both to the purchasing agency and the agency that holds the vehicle that's being used. Next slide, please. So under FAR 18.114 through 18.117, these are provisions that apply for small businesses. For 18.114, it's a reminder that when you're contracting through the 8A program, 8A awards can be made on either sole source or a competitive basis through that program. Generally, that requires that the procurement be for less than 25 million, and the rules that govern this are in FAR subpart 19.8. FAR 18.115 talks about hub zone sole source awards. Just like the 8A program, under certain conditions, you can make sole source awards to hub zone businesses under FAR 19.1306. And there are a couple of thresholds at which that's permitted. It's less than $7 million for manufacturing and less than $4.5 million for other procurements. That's actually similar to the rule for SDVOSBs under FAR 18.116. The only difference is that the threshold for other procurements is $500,000 lower. It's not $4.5 million, it's $4 million. But under FAR 19.1406, you can make SDVOSB sole source awards under those thresholds. And then again, there's a similar rule for economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses and women-owned small business contracts. Those are the same threshold as hub zone contracts, 7 million for manufacturing and 4.5 million for others. All of these authorities, however, require that the agency have a reasonable expectation that it will not receive at least 2 offers from qualified competitors. But if you are in a situation where you have no such reasonable expectation, these authorities are available. Next slide, please. So subpart 18.118 through 124 govern different payment provisions that can be used. 18.118, now notice I skip over a couple because we're going to talk about those on the next slide. But 18.118 talks about overtime approvals, and it reminds you that overtime approvals can be retroactive if they're justified in emergency circumstances under FAR 22.103-4I. 18.121 permits the chief of the contracting office to waive the requirement to obtain a bid guarantee for emergency acquisitions, where, in some circumstances, you would normally be required to have a performance bond or some kind of a payment bond, and it would be required under 28.101-1C. Under certain conditions, that requirement can be waived as specified at that FAR site. For procurements that are governed by 18.122, agencies can authorize advance payments. That can help to streamline the provision of goods or services by making funds available up front. They can be made at or after award of sealed bid contracts, as well as negotiated contracts in accordance with FAR 32.405. Under FAR 18.123, agency can use a no set-off provision to facilitate national defense in the event of a national emergency or national disaster. Now, you notice that one does actually reference natural emergency or natural disaster, which normally require a declaration. This is a provision that would permit the agencies to essentially include in the contract a requirements that says that they won't take a set off in order to facilitate the response to these things. So this one, although it is always there, does require some kind of a natural emergency or a national emergency or natural disaster in order to use. So it's maybe not as uniformly available as the others. FAR 18.124 is a reminder that electronic funds transfer payments can be waived. Normally, the government requires you to be paid by EFT, but where you have an emergency acquisition or there are unusual or compelling needs, you can waive the use of electronic funds transfer. Next slide, please. Then there are some other provisions, and I've got those listed up here on the chart, and these kind of round out what you'll find in FAR 18.1. FAR 18.119, which we skipped over a few minutes ago, is a reminder that policies and procedures of FAR subpart 25.4 may not apply to acquisitions that are not awarded under full and open competition. And that FAR part 25.4 is the part that governs trade agreements. So there are circumstances where you don't have to use the policies and procedures that normally apply to trade agreements. For FAR 18.125, the agency can issue a CICA override after there's a GAO protest. In government contracts, one of the things that is often a worry during the procurement process is whether there will be a protest at GAO. This FAR provision is just a reminder that although the Competition and Contracting Act imposes a mandatory stay of performance in the event that a timely protest is filed at GAO, if the agency has unusual and compelling circumstances, it can use protest override procedures in order to get the procurement moving while the protest proceeds at GAO. FAR 18.126 is a provision that permits the contractor to use government property rent-free. Normally, there are rental requirements that would apply to the use of government property, but those don't apply under certain circumstances under FAR 45.301. And generally, those are circumstances that are part of a general program approved by FEMA that meet the criteria that are specified in that FAR part. FAR 18.127 covers extraordinary contractual actions. And essentially what this does is it permits you to amend contracts without consideration, correct or mitigate mistakes in a contract, or formalize informal commitments for example, oral commitments that might have been made. And there are various authorities that are cited within 18.127 that allow you to take those types of actions without the normal requirements to to go through a full negotiation or or some kind of a competition, depending on how big the amendment might be. So those are the provisions that are listed in FAR 18.1. As you can see, it's really just a laundry list of citations to other sections of the FAR where there are things that would allow you to streamline the acquisition procedures, so long as you meet the conditions that are required to do so. And so whenever you need to get something fast, or if you're a contractor and your customer needs to get something fast and you want to try to help find a way to do it, FAR 18.1, subpart 18.1 is a good place to go and look to see if there's anything in there that fits the situation that you are in, where you might be able to invoke that authority in order to move quicker. Next slide, please. Moving on to FAR subpart 18.2. This is the provision that people probably think of the most when they think about emergency acquisition. These are the specific emergency acquisition flexibilities that exist. And when you read subpart 18.2, you will see that there are essentially 4 different flexibilities that are available. There's one for contingency operations. There's one that covers defense or recovery from certain events, and those are cyber, nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological attack. There's also an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration by the president, and then there's also a humanitarian or peacekeeping operation. Those terms are defined within different provisions of the FAR. So FAR 18.2 has its own citations that talk about these things, but some of them are specifically defined as terms under FAR 2.101. So for example, a contingency operation is defined there, as is a humanitarian or peacekeeping operation. Emergency declaration or major disaster declaration is not specifically defined in the FAR, but this would be a declaration that's under the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act made by the president. And then defense or recovery from certain events also doesn't have a specific definition in the FAR. This would be one where the head of the agency determines that the supplies or services are going to be used in order to either defend against or recover from these types of attacks. So all of these generally require some kind of a declaration from someone before any of these authorities come into play. This subpart FAR 18.2 also in 18.205 has links to the National Recovery Framework and the OFPP guidelines for emergency acquisitions. So the NRF in particular is pretty useful because it establishes a comprehensive national all hazards approach to domestic incident response. And it basically talks about all the roles, responsibilities, structures, how does a national response to one of these events work? So that's a useful reference if you are in one of these situations, and also worth looking at. We'll dive into each of these 4 types of operations and talk about, or declarations, and talk about what happens when they come into play. In the next slide, we'll talk about contingency operation. So for 18.201, contingency operation is defined in FAR 2.101. And you can see the definition that's up there on the screen. It's essentially a military operation designated by the Secretary of Defense. And armed forces could be involved in military actions or hostilities against an enemy of the United States. And it also could also result in the call or order to active duty of members of the uniformed services under various provisions of Title 10. So the contingency operation has a specific FAR definition that has to be met before you can use it. And the designation of a contingency operation would be made by the Secretary of Defense. If a contingency operation is declared, what FAR 18.201 does is it increases various thresholds that apply. So the micro purchase threshold increases to $20,000 for procurements in the US and $35,000 for procurements overseas. The simplified acquisition threshold jumps up to $800,000 in the US and $1.5 million overseas. And for public vouchers, there's an authority that permits the agency to set higher limits for the use of public vouchers. And then you can also use, under FAR 18.201, you can also use simplified acquisition procedures to acquire commercial products or services up to a threshold of 15 million. So what this authority does is it increases a lot of the simplified acquisition thresholds so that you can procure goods and services without the need for full and open competition, provided that you meet the requirements normal to purchases for micro purchases or the simplified acquisition threshold. Next slide, please. FAR 18.202, this is the recovery from cyber, biological, chemical, radiological attack. What this does is, well, when this comes into play is where the head of a contracting agency determines that the supplies or services are going to be used to facilitate defense or recovery from one of these types of attacks. One of the tricky parts about this one is you have to determine who has the authority to make this declaration. So the head of the contracting agency is what's specified in FAR 18.202, but there is the ability to delegate authority. And so you'll have to figure out whether, as permitted by FAR 1.108B and 1.102-5B, that authority has been delegated down to a lower level. If it has, and this has properly been invoked, then you would have the flexibility to use this provision. And what this provision does is it increases the thresholds again. So the micro purchase goes up to 20,000 in the US and 35,000 overseas, just as it did for contingency operation. The simplified acquisition threshold increases again to 800,000 in the US or 1.5 million overseas. And you can, again, just as you could with a contingency operation, use simplified acquisition procedures to acquire commercial products and services up to $15 million. One other thing that's unique about this one is the contracting officers can treat any acquisition of supplies or services as an acquisition of commercial products. That's useful because commercial products procurements typically have fewer incorporated clauses and flow downs. And so that may make it administratively easier for the agency to pull together the contract or for primes to issue subcontracts. So that's 18.202. Next slide, please. So 18.203 is a declaration of emergency or national disaster. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, this is a formal disaster declaration under the Stafford Act at 42 USC 5191B. What this does is a little bit different. It does not increase thresholds, but it permits giving preference to local organizations and firms when contracting for major disaster or emergency assistance activities. So essentially, if a hurricane hits in the Southeast down in Florida, you could use local area set-asides and establish evaluation preferences that give an advantage to local firms in order to try to help mobilize resources that are closer to where the disaster has occurred, and provide use contracting to provide economic relief and an inflow of cash into the area to help with the recovery. It also permits a waiver of the requirements to transport by U.S. flagged vessels that might normally apply. So wherever you might have to use vessels in order to bring in supplies that are needed in order to recover from a disaster, if this declaration has been made, those requirements are waived. Next slide. And then this is the last one. It's humanitarian or peacekeeping operations under FAR 18.204. This one is also defined in FAR Part 2.101. This is a military operation, but it's instead of a contingency operation where we expect to be engaged against an enemy, this is a humanitarian or foreign disaster assistance in support of a peacekeeping operation. So, these kinds of things might be there's some kind of a famine or, an earthquake, and we're helping to respond to the disaster, similar to the tsunami that hit in the Pacific a few years ago, or a typhoon where we're sending in relief somewhere in the Pacific to help with the recovery. If this one is declared, it increases the simplified acquisition, though not as much as the others. The simplified acquisition threshold would increase to $500,000. So this one is not as robust as a contingency operation or a recovery from attack, but it does increase it. It does basically double it. So it makes it a little bit easier to conduct procurements that might help with humanitarian or peacekeeping operations. So those are the four specific authorities that are available under subpart 18.2. Next slide. And just in closing, just a few recommendations for how to use this part and what to do with it. The first is if there's some kind of a disaster or a declaration or some kind of a national emergency or some kind of a military operation that's going on, one of the things you should always be doing is checking to see if there's anything in subpart 18.2 that can be used. Now, prior to using these authorities and assuming, for example, that you can make a purchase under simplified procedures because the simplified acquisition threshold is increased, just as an example, you should make sure that the declaration that declared the national emergency or that declared the contingency operation was properly issued by someone with appropriate authority to do so. So that might require a little bit of homework to dig around and make sure you understand whether, who had the authority and whether the authority was appropriately delegated and whether a declaration was appropriately issued. But if you're in one of those situations, it's always worth checking to see if you can have the flexibilities that are provided by one of these provisions. If you don't have a disaster declaration, you should always also be checking the flexibilities that are listed in subpart 18.1 to see if they apply. They're always out there, and if you meet the conditions that are required to invoke them, you can always use them. So in situations where a streamlined acquisition is desirable, in order to procure goods or services faster, it's always worth checking to see if the conditions in one of these provisions are satisfied, and it may help you to speed up the procurement that you need to conduct. The other thing, just as a reminder that you should always do is always also check the supplemental agency regulations, for example, the DFAR, to make sure that there's no implementing or supplemental guidance as there could be when you use some of the provisions, particularly the ones that are listed under FAR 18.1, and also particularly if you're conducting the interagency acquisitions that are permitted there. You need to check the supplemental agency regulations just to make sure that you comply with all of the rules to properly use those authorities. But that's FAR Part 18. It's actually a pretty straightforward FAR part. It's not as complicated as others, but it is a very useful reference, a cheat sheet to help remind you about different things that exist in the FAR that may help you to streamline and speed up an acquisition if you need it. I appreciate everyone attending. Once again, my name is Lucas Hambach. I'm a shareholder with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell, and that's all I have for you. I'll turn it back over to you, Jennifer.
Great. Lucas, that was a great presentation. I really appreciate the time and effort you took to put together the great content and your time today to share the content with us in a easy to understand format. So thank you again. If anyone has any questions about FAR Part 18, please contact Lucas. You've got his information here. I believe he's also active on LinkedIn. If you're looking for the recording, as mentioned, you can find all of our recordings on our YouTube channel. There's now 670 government contracting webinars, all complimentary. So feel free to subscribe to our channel. It doesn't cost anything. And this Friday we are skipping due to the Easter holiday. So we'll see you next week on Wednesday for FAR Part 19, and then Friday we'll jump into FAR Part 20. Thanks, Lucas, and thanks everybody who took time to join us today.
Thank you.